Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Fireside Chat, Human Intelligence and Artificial Intelligence, the Performance Advantage. We're going to look at how to build a learning strategy that thinks faster and learns smarter. I am thrilled to have you with us for this important and timely conversation about the evolving intersection of human and artificial intelligence in the world of learning and development. I'm Ed Monk, CEO of the LPI, the Learning and Performance Institute. I'm going to be your host for the next 45 minutes as we explore how L&D teams can unlock greater performance by blending the best of both worlds, human insight and AI-powered execution. Joining me is someone who brings really deep expertise, some thoughtful perspective, and importantly, real-world experience to this topic, Dr. Ashwin Mehta. He's the founder of Methodology and chief AI strategist at the LPI. His work sits at the crossroads of AI, learning design, and business performance. I can't think of a better person to help us navigate this space. So welcome, Ash. Today's session is not about the hype. It's about what's real. What AI can do to speed up scale and personalize learning, and obviously where human intelligence still leads the way through creativity, empathy, and strategic judgment. So if you're just beginning your journey with AI or you're looking to sharpen your strategy, we'll be diving into practical insights that you can apply, from designing for performance to augmenting your teams to using data and AI responsibly. Remember, if you want, you can post any questions or comments in the chat, but let's get started straight away. Ash, hi, how are you doing?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Good to see you, and thanks for having me here. Good to see you, everybody who's joining us live on the webinar link.
Fantastic. Well, I will not get distracted by the guitars because we could talk for 45 minutes about those. Let's get straight into it. So my first question, and it's not intended to trip you up. I'm sure you won't be by this, but I just wanted to turn things on their head a little bit. What, in your opinion, would be a common misconception that L&D teams have in 2025 about what AI can do?
So I think there are two angles to approach this question. So the first one is really we have hype, we have disruption, we have things that are going on in the marketplace, and it's easy to fall into one of two camps. So the first camp is this stuff's happening out there, but our roles are fine. The things that we do aren't going to be touched by AI. There is nothing that's going to affect us. Our roles will continue. If we remember the hype around the death of the LMS, the death of e-learning, and look, we're still here. We still have LMSs. We still have e-learning. I think that's one perspective where that's the head in the sand perspective. There is disruption out there, and it will be transformational. It will change some of the things. And part of the journey for us is to figure out what that change is and hopefully steer that change. So I think that's one aspect of it. But the second aspect is, and we see this all over social media, LinkedIn, we see lots of this at conferences as well, where we say, AI, something, unrealistic expectation. AI is going to do this. AI is going to do that. And we have to some degree, acknowledge that this is still emerging technology. Things are being refined. Things are evolving. We had this first wave where we were talking about conversational agents and look how human they are, but they're very rarely accurate. And then we started moving down things like chain of thought and reasoning, where these models were taking a little bit longer to respond, but they were responding in a slightly different way and giving us more accurate answers. Maybe we had some search capability. So things are evolving. And because things are evolving, we shouldn't have the unrealistic expectation that, you mentioned the guitars. First time when I was 14 years old and I picked up a guitar, I was not shredding solos at Wembley Stadium, right? It takes time to go and play gigs and sharpen your craft and go and practice. So the same is true with AI. We don't have emerging technologies that at a click of a button can replace people's roles. But what we do have is we have technologies that are evolving, people who are practicing, companies that are developing iteratively in a way that eventually we will have workflows that replace previous workflows. So the pace of change and the accuracy of what's possible now is probably the other side of the myth.
Yeah, I like that. Training industry would echo what you're saying. They released a report recently. I've got it here. They emphasize that while AI can enhance efficiency in L&D, human skills remain essential. and they advocate for aligning AI-driven learning with human-centric development strategies. Can I put you on the spot? Have you got any examples where AI actually improved efficacy or learning outcomes, to be really specific, but only
So
because also guided by that human judgment as well?
it's mixed at the moment. So I won't
Right.
give you a finding one way or another. And the reason it's mixed is because the technology is emerging, the research also is emerging, and we see some papers where we're saying that we're getting a performance benefit where folks are using AI, and we have some studies around that. But on the flip side, you get well, there are perceptions of overqualification, or there's an increase in procrastination, or there is a decreased cognitive engagement with some of the materials. So while you can do something now and you can do it quickly and efficiently, then you forget the thing that you've done because you didn't really have to think your way through a process. So the perspectives are emerging. So it's difficult to say right now which way it will go. It very much depends on what the target use case and what the application is as to whether or not you will get efficacy in a business sense. Now, to
Mm.
flip that slightly, when you say, is there going to be cognitive efficiency? I think the jury's also out on that. Really, where we're seeing the efficiency or the effectiveness right now is reducing cost base of some of the things that used to take a long time. And that's why it's so attractive to businesses.
Yeah. One of the criticisms of generative AI in particular is that perhaps it doesn't have that empathy or that nuance. So how do we make sure in learning, organizational learning, that we're not over automating the parts of learning that do require empathy or nuance? Or do you think that's a non-issue?
Partly, I think it's a non-issue, and for two reasons. One is the emerging nature of technology, which means that very soon we're going to get that nuance from the technology that's available. We're starting to see models that are a little bit more nuanced in terms of behavioral or emotional output. We're also starting to see voice models and vision models that can give us a little bit more of that human touch. It's not perfect, of course, but it's moving very, very quickly. But on the other side, I always like to counter with this, and that is that it's it's good for us in the public domain to have this debate. But if we stand on our soapbox and we start to think about, what's the burden for a machine to do something? It should be that it's doing it better than the humans were doing it before.
Mm.
And if we hand on our heart, look around the industry, we look around not only our industry, but human capital and some of the other associated industries, marketing, sales, communication, all of these things, we have an ideal. And that ideal that we're talking about in the rhetoric of the AI revolution is around why would we expect a machine to be able to have the same context, the same nuance, the same emotion, the same behavior as a person, when frankly, people have been doing this in a manner that's pretty bad for many, many years. Not everybody is the nuanced and emotive contextual speaker that some of their colleagues might be. So we have to have some bearing in reality. The human attributes are normally distributed. Usually you have a mean, you have some outliers either side, and you have most of the population somewhere in the middle. Where do we want to draw the line for AI or the machines? It should be that we're getting some kind of benefit. It's unrealistic to say right now that we're going to get something that is contextual, emotional, and nuanced from a machine, but it's probably coming.
Yeah, and pretty quickly, I would imagine. So, in looking at skills gaps within an organization, then sort of more holistically now, are you aware of how AI is being used to identify gaps? It's something that the LPI is being brought in to do a lot at the moment in large
Mhm.
organizations, kind of like that capability mapping, skills analysis. Are you seeing any good examples of AI playing a role in identifying skills gaps? And how do we validate, sort of follow on question to this, what it tells us as well? Because we surely need to have that validation, don't we, of it? Or do we just trust it?
Again, great question, and sort of mirrors the response that I just gave.
Yeah.
That let's forget AI for a second. Let's just put it over here and just ignore it. How well have we been doing skills validation in this industry to date? Pretty badly, right? So we have platforms that have skills taxonomies and skills ontologies, and usually we use declarative data. So we say to learners, declare, how well do you think you have this skill? Do you think you're an excellent communicator? Do you think you're great at negotiation? And usually folks will go, you know what, out of 10, I think I'm an 8. Great. And we pretty much don't bother validating that. We just take it as data, and then somehow we use that to identify our gaps. And can we do better than that? Well, we can do better than that, right? But we have to also acknowledge in the skill space that there is, if anybody who's watching, if you're familiar with data ecology, if not, go and look it up, have a little bit of a Google around this. But we have various terminologies that we use in learning. So we think about tasks, activities, capabilities, skills, proficiencies. All of these things are ever so slightly different. And before November 22, before we had this current wave of the revolution, we had this concept of skills-based organizations that are, and this concept is still being implemented across big businesses today, fueled to some degree by the platform architectures that are out in the market. Now, back then it was fine. We had something where we had declarative data, we had a concept, and we had something that potentially was understandable within a business that you could use to evolve your business in some way. Now we have competing levels of data ecology. So what that means, data ecology, is if you take findings at an individual level, they're not ascribable to a group level and vice versa because they're different levels. If we think about what we're doing in the AI space, mostly we're looking at tasks and activities. We think about automations, we think about workflows, we think about processes, and that tends to be at the task and activity level, an activity being an aggregation of tasks, which has no relationship and no bearing at all on the skills level of data. They're very different levels.
Yeah.
Now, it's going to depend, for me, it's going to depend on how a lot of the technical architecture plays out and how the market uses that technical architecture in the future to start to think about, well, what's a skill? How do we validate it? Because if all we're doing is we're validating task proficiency, that's not the same as skills. And that then takes me down the route of how do we measure this stuff. So if we're talking about knowledge workers who are talking back and forth with a conversational agent, we can analyze the transcripts of what's being said and what's being asked. That gives us trend data on what are the questions that are being asked in by an individual repeatedly, or what are the trends in what's being asked in a population. So we can start to identify the gaps in what people know. We can start to identify the gaps in the tasks that are being completed, etc., etc. So you go down that road of saying, well, we have task and activity gaps, which we can plug either with interventions, learning interventions, or we can plug those with a workflow build. So we automate this part of the process and therefore people don't need to know about it anymore. But I don't think that's necessarily the same as skills. So I think there's something that's going to play out in the data where we say, well, what level should we be looking at when we think about our organizations? And what level should we be looking at when we think about interventions? And most likely that's not going to be at the skills level, but I think I'll wait to see how that plays out before I rest my cap on a particular finding.
Well, yeah, we're seeing we've got some questions coming in, which is great. In fact, let's go to Richard. What's the biggest misconception L&D leaders have about using AI in practice? And let's come back to that, the biggest misconception. But on your point there, it reminds me of the kind of data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid. You know, you collect the data, you lead to that. Do you think that we're going to be at a point where we can tier people in terms of being informed, competent, capable? Or do you think we're at a point where the knowledge economy is now shattered because there's a democratization of information, and actually it's going to be a new skills taxonomy? Where do you think we're going to go with this idea of information and skills and capability and competency?
So there's a thing around, I think it happened around Napster time, but let's talk about Netflix for those of us who are slightly younger in the room. There was a time when we used to prioritize. I don't know if you remember ever having like a CD or a tape or something like, right, where you'd have
Are you asking
possession
me,
of a thing. Yeah. Or rhetorically asking everybody who's watching that you used to have a CD or a DVD or a tape or something where you said, I have physical ownership over an artifact. There's a thing, I can hold it in my hand. There's information on this thing or in this thing, but it's not really about the information. It's about the physical thing that I have in my hand. And over time, we moved towards I want access to a library of information. So now you have Netflix rather than having lots of DVDs because you want access to that thing. Same with Spotify, same, etc., etc. So we're kind of at a pivotal moment like that, where we're moving from I know lots of things to I know where to find out lots of things. And that is something that we need to see play out a little bit before we understand what is the taxonomy and hierarchy of being good at finding things out. It used to be that we could, to some degree, structure what research looks like. So people used to go to libraries, read some books, find some papers. This is how they find out their information. But now it's quite disparate. You can go to any number of sources, you can find out any number of things. And crucially, those number of things might be true or not true. So you need to then chase that and find out a little bit more. And that's not something we, in the current population climate, it's not something we really have pedigree in, because we've had social media for quite a long time and people are fairly used to seeing something and just believing it and not going down rigorous fact checking. So I think these kinds of things are going to be way more important than probably the existing taxonomy of understanding and knowing things. And that eventually will take you to a hierarchy that I think is slightly different, probably including metacognition rather than knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. And I think many years ago, Charles Jennings, and this quote is probably the one I quote more than any other. I think you know where I'm going with this. He said that accessibility has replaced knowledge retention as power within business. And that was very much pre-ChatGPT. Obviously, it was as people were starting to build LXPs and content was king, even before the context was king argument. Yet now I think we're at a point where meaningfulness, and it might sound a little bit, weak as an argument, this, but meaningfulness in learning experiences seems to be really important, yet is almost acting in conflict with convenience. So we can access all of this content, great. But the example I would give you is it seems to me that we're mirroring the music industry a little bit. So you talk about tapes and CDs. I remember vinyl. That's how old I am. So now we can download any album that we want within seconds. But equally, people will still pay hundreds of pounds to see Taylor Swift or Oasis in concert. So sometimes it's about meaningfulness, isn't it? Or is that being too, as my daughter would say, am I deeping it there?
So I'm gonna pick on that a little bit, because meaningful and meaningful, let's talk about those ever so slightly differently. So if anybody remembers Anderson and Garrison, communities of practice researchers, so back in 2003 there was a paper on interaction equivalence in learning. So we have a learner-teacher interaction, a learner-learner interaction, peer interaction, social learning, and learner content interactions, where you meaningfully or critically engage with the materials. The learner-teacher interaction is the more knowledgeable other, the Vygotskian paradigm of stretch goals and zone of proximal development and all of that. Now, if you think about all of those in interaction equivalence, what we're thinking about is what interactions are required to have a meaningful learning experience. And the reason the word meaningful is used is because in learning theory, we say we have a mental model of the world and we make meaning based on the stimulus, the information that we get. And we make meaning and we craft our own mental model of the world, and that somehow changes. So in educational theory, we have this thing around meaningful learning. When we think about social experiences, that meaning or meaningfulness has a parallel, because this shapes who we are, right? It makes us reflect on our world views, on our outlook, and it has a cultural significance. So although it's similar, I think it's upon us as learning professionals to understand the difference when we're crafting learning experiences. So that one word is very meaningful, there it is, to the entire profession, and we need to be clear on what we mean by that word.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. And Nick Shackleton-Jones talks in his book about this principle of homeostasis, where humans continuously want to make things easier for themselves. That's something that we've done throughout our existence. Yet that doesn't necessarily lend itself to, great andragogical experiences in terms of meaningfulness as you're defining it. So I think it's really important that One of the questions actually that's come in on a different platform, which, in fact, I'll come to that one in a second. I want to push you on this point, right? Do you think, if you had to choose one driver, do you think we need to make learning more convenient or more meaningful?
Meaningful. Do you want me to elaborate on that?
No, actually, no.
Okay, fine, done.
I think, no, go on. Elaborate on it.
So we need to think about what we mean by learning. In corporate world, what we're saying is that it's usually some mixture of training or behavioral training,
Yeah.
or possibly compliance or something. But it's a driver from the business to go and do something. But when we think about people, whether they're at work or whether they're at home, people are solving problems by going and finding the answers, by going and finding the know-how and the way to do something, finding the information that they need, and then activating all of that in the moments of need to solve a problem and to make basically life, the universe, and everything just a little bit better. That's an innate human condition. We're all doing it, and we're doing it all the time. Learning in that respect is, whether it's convenient or not, the ambition of mankind will crawl over broken glass to find the thing that they need to make the species move forward, to make life, the universe, culture, society happen. That is way more meaningful than we tick the box on a compliance course and therefore we call that learning. So we need to split these things out and be sure on what we're talking about. But I think therefore meaningfulness is something that we really need to be clear on when we're talking about learning.
Isn't this the paradox of AI when it comes to learning, though? That, I mean, before generative AI became so prevalent in our world, before November 2022, I'm not saying it didn't exist before then, of course, 1950s and probably earlier, as you would advocate. But before its kind of mass usage in November 2022, are you going to say earlier than that as well, Ash?
No, carry on.
Okay. And, November 22 explodes, right? And prior to that, the number one challenge for CLOs in Europe, where we researched, was employee engagement and building a learning culture. Has AI solved the employee engagement, building a learning culture piece? Are people within workplaces learning more? Because I would argue they're not, but they are accessing information. Where do you stand on that debate? It's quite a philosophical one, I know.
So where I stand on that debate is that fundamentally we have technology can do things for us. That pace has increased. So the things that are happening for us is very different. I think I'll have a little bit of a hesitation on this because I think we need to look outside of the CLO and learning industry to figure out what the impact of tech actually is. And if we were to go to operations, for example, or we go to sales, or we go to something that's not learning, they might have a different answer on what the impact is. And therein lies a dichotomy, because we have a department in a business that's only one department in a business that isn't necessarily always connected to everything else that's happening. So is it the best source of data? I would say that probably not. We need to include everybody in this debate rather than just a single department.
Yeah, we should go outside. I had an amazing meeting with a company called DRPG recently who do digital twinning, but they're a creative comms agency. Yeah. And I learned so much in there that would influence how we operate in learning and development, in how they've pivoted, embraced technology. It's now part of what they do. Creatively, it's an empowering tool rather than a threat to them. So in terms of like individual skills within learning, and I don't want to say, which roles are threatened by this, but what should learning professionals be upskilling in to maintain gainful employment in the future? Because there is a fear. Would you agree there's a fear, Ash?
Yeah, there is a fear, and the fear is right. And let me drill into that for a second. So we have value chains in a business. Value chain is you take some things, you have some processes or some throughput, and then you produce some outputs and you sell those to the market and you make revenue. This is true of pretty much every business, whether it's a service or product business. And you have enabling functions which are not part of that value chain. So people and skills or task and activity completion might be part of this value chain, but the enabling function of L&D isn't really part of that value chain. It's slightly aside from that, and it enables things within the value chain, which means that it has a slightly different onus of scrutiny, a slightly different onus of return on investment, and all of these things that we say are slightly difficult, right? Now, where am I going with this? When we think about the value chain of any business, and we think about value even within an L&D department, the value chain of that, we have roles that have existed for a long time, but maybe weren't adding as much value as they should have.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to kind of be honest with ourselves as an industry that there are some roles that, we probably, if we were designing this from scratch, we wouldn't have those roles in place. Those roles pretty much can go. Whether AI or no AI, those roles can go. The second tier is where we have roles that largely they were throughput roles. So if we think about the old data entry clerks of the 1950s, or the telephone operators where they used to change the cables and route people through.
Yeah.
Those kinds of roles also, now we have a wave of automation and AI, those kinds of roles can also go. So the reason I say that is we do have some threat out there in the disruption itself. And we need to be realistic about that threat. It's head in the sand moment to say, no, that will never affect us. So that needs to be acknowledged somewhere along the lines. The flip side of that is, where should we be focusing? So my perspective on this is that we have three things to think about. We either have, in the future, we're going to have three things: human, AI, and the fuel for all of this stuff, which is data. So what we want in the future is humans and AI to work synergistically together, getting the best outcomes for business, getting the best outcomes for people, in a way that human hierarchies, organizational structures, skills, taxonomies of activities and tasks, however, whatever terminology we use around that, is working seamlessly with multi-agent frameworks and agentic workflows, such that everybody's doing the thing that is best suited for them. And therein lies a little bit of task fit analysis. So what is AI really good at, and what should we be using agents for? What are people really good at, and what should we be using people for? And all of this stuff in a utopian kind of hierarchy, it all works seamlessly. And the fuel for all of that is data. So we have three things that L&D departments could be thinking of going into. Thing one is, who looks after the people, who looks after the human hierarchy, who architects that human hierarchy? What should be these people be doing? How do we partition roles across machine and human? And how do we free up all of that time or space or thinking space for the folks? And what do we do around that? So that's a very human lens. We then have the agent structure. So what are the agentic workflows? What are the multi-agent hierarchies? How do we architect them around processes? What things should be the AI agent, the nebulous AI, what things should they be doing? That's probably a conversation back and forth with tech teams, or maybe is led by tech teams. If you want to get into that space, then you need to upskill in that area if you're currently not in that area.
Yeah.
And then the third is, agents are going to use data, people are going to use data. Where is the data coming from? If you're in an organization, where is your data held? How is it stored? How is it labeled? How is it tagged? What is it used for? Is it in databases? Is it indexed? All of these questions lead you to the idea of curation. So that's also an area that L&D could be going into. But these three things together have to work in a way that is a force multiplier for your business and is not doing the same thing as everybody else. Because if you're doing the same thing as everybody else, then you're not special. You don't have competitive advantage. So architecting all of that, I think L&D folks could be going into any of these areas. It just depends on what you want to do, what your business wants you to do, where your skills are. Is it easy for you to upskill? Do you have a natural affinity for numbers? Do you have a natural affinity for people? These are the kinds of things that are personal decisions.
And what I'm hearing is data is at the heart of that. It all starts
Absolutely.
with data. Okay.
Yeah.
Couple of examples that I would share. Salesforce has implemented Career Connect, sorry. So that's a career coaching tool, and Career Agent, which assists employees in internal career development. That's a good example of AI do personalized learning and upskilling. And Duolingo famously leveraged generative AI to double its language course offerings, as I'm sure you're aware, with absolutely remarkable commercial growth. Unbelievable. In a very short period of time. A couple of questions to wrap up before we go to questions then. couple of questions from me before we go to questions from the audience. Where do you stay in the loop? Where does somebody like Dr. Mehta stay in the loop when it comes to finding out about AI and L&D? Because to coin an AI phrase, it's an ever-evolving landscape. So where do you go?
I foster many capabilities.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many people watching this do this, but I read everything all the time. And the only way to get better at being informed is to absorb as much information as you can. So I will read empirical articles all the way through to meta-analyses in the scientific literature, all the way through to, you know, looking on the internet, looking on LinkedIn, seeing what people are sharing, all the way through to things like Instagram. So that's my like information layer. But I'm also talking to suppliers on a regular basis and figuring out what they're doing, not just in the L&D space. So I'm quite heavily involved in things like the startup space, the tech space as well. And I have a company, so I'm building things. I'm building things for myself. I'm building things for clients. So I'm always actually actioning some of the things that I do as well. I'm trying to problem solve and trying to find things out. So, and what I've said there is sometimes it's difficult for folks, because if you are in a role, you're in an L&D role, your day-to-day, for example, might be to make e-learning. You probably don't have much opportunity to go and build agents or agentic workflows, or to architect applications, or to do software development, or any of these things that allow me to keep my fingers in the pie and to keep informed. So it's always imperative that you find out your own opportunities and your own appetite for doing things. But I will do that spectrum of things, and that usually keeps me fairly well informed.
Yeah, it's that concept of learnership that I've been writing about a lot, that you have to practice what you preach, really, and be a learning leader in every sense of those two words. That's great to hear. Obviously, we're co-chairing an event at the end of June, Learning Live AI, which is free to attend if you're responsible for AI in learning. You can register for that. I'm sure the team will probably share a link with you to go to that. One piece of advice then, coming from you, if you were to say to L&D leaders the one piece of advice to prepare for the next 12 months, bearing in mind everything might have changed in the last half an hour that we were speaking when it comes to AI, what would be your one piece of advice?
One piece of advice is nearly always the same, and that is know thyself, right? What is it that you do in your business that is valuable, adds to the rest of your business? Somehow it moves the bottom line of your business, and could or could not be easily replaced by something that happens in the market tomorrow. As Ed has just said, speaking to the audience, as Ed has just said, the market is moving quickly. Things are evolving. The technology is moving. And if what you're worried about is that something comes out tomorrow that replaces something that you easily do, then it probably will. Because if it's something you easily do, then it's something everybody else already easily does as well. Think of the bits that add value, and those are the bits where you can really shine. But you only know that if you know yourself, right?
Yeah. Okay, turn that on its head then, which is related to a question coming in on LinkedIn, actually. What if we were to choose a particular skill to upskill in? Let's say we're a learning professional that's done something that could easily be replaced, right? I think I need to diversify. It's not a case of I'm going to gen up on generative AI generally. It's what should I be looking at then? Is it about incorporating the utilization of AI, like prompt engineering, to understand how to maximize the responses that I'm getting to formulate content? Or is that just pumping my own company full of content? And actually, I should be doing something else. Is it data analysis? What would you say if you were starting out in your career now, or maybe 3 or 4 years in a learning role, in an L&D function, in a FTSE 250, and you're thinking, my role's definitely at risk? What would you do?
I'm going to try not to sound trite about this, Ed, but I think there are a few things. It's not just one thing.
Yeah.
One area is definitely data. And Data can mean lots of things for lots of people. It doesn't have to be complicated data science. For some folks, that would be complicated. For others, it's less complicated. But around the data, it's a little bit around curiosity. So if you have, I'll bring this right down to tactics. If you have a course, people have gone through the course, you've got completion data. That completion data basically doesn't mean anything. You can bin that and nobody would care. If you want to find out what the impact was, that's a very different question. Now, the point about data is, for you need to have the curiosity to go find out the data that's going to give you the information on the impact of that course, not how many people sat in a chair, but you need to be curious enough and tenacious enough to go into your business and find out the data that you need. That data could come in many formats. It could be that you interview people and you find things out. It could be that you look at sales statistics. It could be that you look at operational metrics. Whatever it happens to be, all of these things are sources of data, but you need to be able to be curious enough to find that stuff out and then relate it back to the impact of the activities that you did. So that's on the data side. I think that's a skill set that people should probably have. On the agility side, this is the bit that I say is going to sound trite, but I'll say it anyway. On the agility side is we need to be able to pivot. We need to be able to try something else, figure out how to use it, and then move from that if it's not giving us what we need. The market is moving. It's moving very quickly. And sometimes you might be using one tool and you need to pivot to something else because it's not giving you what you need. Thankfully, user interfaces are effectively homogeneous at this point, so the barrier to entry is fairly limited. It's fairly small.
Yeah, I mean, I see this as a good time to be looking at this because it's only potentially going to get harder, or there's going to be more skilled people. But now it's democratized as an opportunity. It's almost like Darwinism, but people misinterpret Darwinism. It's not survival of the strongest; it's survival of those who are most capable of adapting. So this is a true test of that, I think, because we've democratized content. Then how do we pivot? How do we remain agile, move to a different role, create a role that doesn't even exist at the moment for ourselves? Rich has got a question. How do organizations avoid these AI tools becoming just another layer of admin or complexity? Richard doesn't sound too happy about AI tools coming in here, but can we cheer him up?
Yeah, to some degree. It depends on what you mean by AI tools. So we need to distinguish between what are point solutions and what are general solutions. A general solution would be a ChatGPT or something like that, which is out there. You access it in a browser. You can do lots of different things with it. Now, you do have, of course, governance is a thing that every organization should do when they're implementing tools. That's no surprise that we need to mention that. But when you start to standardize things, it tends to be point solutions that get standardized. So if we think about, we're making avatar videos in Synthesia, Colossi, and HN R1, one of those style tools, there likely will be a process around that, an intake process, a throughput process, alpha, beta approval, and then something else. It's already now become admin. It's already to some degree become a little bit stale and boring. Whereas when you have curious people able to interface with general purpose tools and find out what they need to find out, it becomes very different. Complexity is increased, but it's less administrative. So in terms of avoiding these tools becoming administrative or boring or useless or whatever terminology we want to use, it's going to depend a little bit on how you use it, but it also is going to depend a little bit on the solution that you've selected to bring into your IT environment as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, there's so many now as well these days. Lynn, let's take a look at her question. Do you see lots of organizations moving swiftly now to start using so that they're using AI so they're not left behind? Is fear a motivator here?
Yeah, FOMO's not a strategy, right? It shouldn't be a strategy anyway, but
it's a culture.
It is. And I would say, do I see a lot of organizations moving swiftly? No, because if they were moving swiftly, they would have done this 2 years ago. But right now, if any organizations are suddenly thinking, let's do AI so we don't miss out, say the same thing that I always say, and that is figure out what your purpose is, deploy technology against the business problem to get business value. And that way, you're investing carefully in the future of your business. If you want to implement something just because you saw somebody else do it, then it might be a waste of money, it might be a waste of time, it might be the best thing you've ever done. You've got no real way of finding out.
Yeah, I agree. A final question on the ethical side of it then. Co-Fence underscores the importance of human vetted intelligence in ensuring AI systems are aligned with expert insights. So they focus on the necessity of human oversight. And Business Insider has produced countless reports on the importance of responsible AI use among younger generations. You've been pretty vocal from the early days about the ethical side of it. Do we need to be worried about this? Obviously, some people would argue that if we're all using the same data, we're all just going to become vanilla, having the same thoughts, creating the same kind of experiences, or is that a myth? What should we be worried about, or should we not be worried at all?
So we should be worried about some things, and one of those things is the longer term societal and organizational effects of moving a working population from problem solving and using initiative towards asking the magic button on the screen what to do. Because at some point we're going to be less effective at problem solving than we already are. And I do say with lots of caveats, because I don't think, I think generally speaking, human attributes, as I've mentioned, are normally distributed in a population. And it's difficult to ascribe a high level of problem solving to the entirety of the population. Some will be better, some will be worse. But over time, we'll have this erosion of the capabilities of being able to discriminate between what is truth and what is fiction, or an erosion in the capabilities of decision making and problem solving. The things that we say are innately human. The more we remove all of that from our working burden, the more we lose the ability to do that. We're less practiced, we get atrophy. So there is that risk in society and in organizations, as well as the risk of workforce displacement and what will people do as the machines are capable of doing lots of things. So we have these big questions, but there are risks on the horizon.
Well, I mean, we live in a very polarized world. I would argue that these days it can be more about controlling a narrative rather than the truth being important. I'm not going to talk about who I'm talking about, but I think we can probably all have a guess. So is AI going to help us with this? Because it's not a single source of truth. It's aggregating content. Is it going to further polarization? Or are we going to be able to use this as a tool to educate and reduce the amount of discrimination and negative thought? Are we still going to be able to think critically, Ash?
So I'll mention the term AI SEO at this point, which is, if anybody knows SEO, search engine optimization, you go to Google and you have, to some degree, websites that are optimized for that particular search. Now we're seeing websites that are optimized for inclusion in AI searches, so ChatGPT, Claude, etc. So there is a distinction in what's happening. Now, just with anything else, you have the capability to control what goes into the engine and what isn't in the engine. So I think it's difficult to say that any of these tools, technologies, techniques that we use are going to be free of bias. There is always going to be something or someone controlling what you see, which is why when you asked me earlier what I use to inform myself, I mentioned many different sources of information. It's imperative on us to be able to diversify in the information that we see.
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? We must be able to do that ourselves. Ash, I'm conscious of the time. We're hitting the 45-minute mark. It's been an absolute pleasure and a joy to talk to you and to learn from you today. Thanks to everyone who engaged with the chat as well and asked questions. I hope we see you at Learning Live AI. We've built that event for you, got you in mind. Ash, thank you. I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks for having me, Ed.